Alright guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Throne and Liberty beta. It's been available to play for a couple days now. I'm not sure when it ends, but the game comes out in mid-September, I believe. And this video is going to focus mostly on how it runs on PC. We'll check out a few different settings. We'll check out some DLSS, FSR, and that sort of thing. So I'll just share what I have discovered playing the game for about a day or so. Let's go ahead and take a quick look at the settings here. There's a lot of settings, and I think the game's actually very scalable. For example, on the system requirements recommended page, they list an i5 11600K for processor and RTX 2070 Super for GPU with 16 gigs of RAM. That's very reasonable for a brand new MMORPG that runs on Unreal Engine 5. But anyway, we're going to be targeting maximum everything just because we're using pretty high-end hardware here, RTX 4090, Ryzen 7800X 3D, and we're looking at 4K. We do have access to DLSS, we do have frame generation, and we also have FSR 2, no FSR frame generation, but just remember this is a beta, so chances are that by the time it comes out, it probably will have FSR 3 and frame generation. For settings, we have a lot of them actually. Take a look at this. It's a ton of settings that you can knock down, and we're going to take a look at that as well, by the way. But let's go ahead and start with Epic. Another thing to keep in mind is that if you change the preset at all, like even if I go to high or then I go back to Epic, it does actually kick on DLSS quality by default whenever you change that. So it can be quite a bit distracting, because I tried to record Epic, no DLSS, and then it kicked it on and I didn't know. So here we go. We're going to turn DLSS off. We should be at native 4K. That'll kind of give us an idea of what we're dealing with here. So here we go. We have native 4K on an RTX 4090, and we seem to be hovering between 60 and 70 FPS. Now, a lot of things will impact the performance as well, like the areas that you're in, like the weather type, that sort of thing will also affect it. So look at that, we jumped to 100 FPS somehow. You know what, let me just make sure that DLSS is off. It is off. Okay, so yeah, clearly as you saw, the FPS can jump up and down quite a bit depending on what's happening, but I would say this is pretty good. Now the combat is actually, if you played World of Warcraft or anything like that, it's actually quite similar. It's you can tap target, and you can either play in like classic mode, you know, where you move the mouse and the camera moves as well, or you can press V and then the mouse becomes freely available. You right click and move the camera. If you played MMORPGs, you'll be very familiar with this, and I have a lot actually. Played a lot of MMORPGs. I do love MMORPGs, so that's one of the main reasons why I've been really looking forward to this game. And now, while looking at the frame time, you might think, well, you know, it's not very consistent. And yeah, you would be right. 1% lows are in the 40s, which is not too bad. But there are areas where you'll hit some just random stutters, which can be rather unpleasant at times. But it's not too bad, right? Now we're going to make our way to the city, and I'll show you something else that's kind of interesting there, actually. The city has a lot of players. This is like a starting area, and a ton of players equals a lot of heavy load on the CPU, and that's what we're gonna take a look at as well, because this game can be quite CPU heavy in certain scenarios. Obviously that kind of makes sense. And I've actually captured some footage the other day where there was a lot of people, which is going to be a good benchmark for us to take a look at. Now, I don't know about rating. I don't know a whole lot about this game other than the fact that it looks like something I would want to play. But I wonder what performance would be like in big raids or big outdoor events. And I think this city is probably the closest that I have access to. So this here is the city square. As you can see here, we're going to be dropping in FPS quite a bit. Well, check this out. Let's go ahead and try DLSS balance, right? And see what type of performance we get. And we're in the hundreds of FPS. Actually, this is pretty good, but there isn't a lot of players here either, okay? So let's take a look at a scenario where there is a lot of players. And this was yesterday's footage I captured in the evening, and as you can see, there's way more players now, and we're dropping into the 60s. We are actually hitting some CPU limitations throughout this area. If you look at the GPU use, we're dropping below 99%. I still find it to be rather impressive that we're able to stay above 60 with so many players, right? CPU limitations have always been a thing, even back playing World of Warcraft in high player count scenarios, big raids, that sort of thing. But yeah, this is a ton of players, and I'm glad I actually captured this footage last night because this morning it wasn't a lot of people. But let's go ahead and drop to DLSS Quality and just see the type of performance that we get. So we seem to be at around 100 FPS. Now look at the GPU utilization up there. We are dropping sometimes as low as 58% GPU utilization, right? So yeah, areas like this will be rather CPU heavy, but out in the world it's actually not too bad. But this is, I would expect this type of performance with so many players in one area, right? There's a lot of things for the CPU to keep track of and generate, but yeah, it's actually quite impressive. I think they do have some room for improvements on the performance for this game, but I have to say, I mean, for a beta, it's actually not too bad, and the game looks really good too. I do have another clip though I want to show that shows a very heavy GPU bound scenario. This was a short clip I captured last night, and it presents a rainy weather scenario. And if you look, we're getting 45 FPS. This is at native 4K, by the way, with the epic graphical preset. And yeah, this presents probably worst case scenario as far as graphical demand on your GPU, which you could probably overcome with some DLSS or settings tweak. You can actually gain a lot more FPS just by going from the epic to the high graphical preset. We're going to take a look at that as well. But let's take a look at DLSS. Sorry about that, guys. That was me. I just got a call on Steam, and I only had a little bit of that footage that I had access to, so I couldn't really cut it out. So my bad for that. But now we're back to mid-60s FPS. We're regular weather. It's morning, and we're going to go from native 4K epic graphical preset to DLSS quality. And DLSS actually looks really good in this game. As a matter of fact, it can look even better than native, and I will show you that. We'll also take a look at some FSR as well and compare the two briefly. I didn't want to spend too much time and check every graphical setting out because this is a beta, and I don't feel it's going to be representative when the final game releases. So I'm going to save that for that. But just so you know, there is a lot of performance you can gain back by just going from the epic to the high graphical preset. And I get it, this is the RTX 4090, the most powerful GPU, but this is also at 4K, right? If you had, say, a 4070 or a 7800 XT and you're playing at 1440p, you're probably going to get similar performance I'm getting on the 4090 at 4K at 1440p. At least that's been the case based off my own comparisons that I've done. I get similar FPS on my 3080 Ti at 1440p I get on my 4090 at 4K, if that makes sense. Or 6800 XT and 7900 XTX, if that makes sense. In a lot of scenarios, anyway. But as you can see, with DLSS set to quality, we can stay at around 80 to 90 FPS in the heavy foliage areas. And then here in the shore, we're hitting 100, 110 FPS, which is actually pretty good. Next, I wanted to touch on a ghosting issue. So this is native 4K with the game's own TAA. They don't let you choose TAA or TSR or anything like that. This is with both upscalers turned off. And as you can see, if you look at those fireflies in the background, there's a bit of ghosting, even at native 4K. Well, let's go ahead and try FSR balance here at 4K. Now that ghosting is actually increased. And then with DLSS balance, it actually cleans up the ghosting. I don't think I've seen this before. There's more ghosting at native 4K with TAA, TSR, whatever it is they're using, but DLSS cleans it up rather nicely. Here's all three side by side. This was the very first time I did notice the ghosting, actually. Look at the level of ghosting, just panning the camera around. This is at native 4K, by the way, with no upscaling of any kind. Let's try introducing some DLSS here, and we'll go with DLSS Quality. Look at that, guys. It's clean. There's no ghosting at all, actually. Looks very nice. And we get the bonus of getting even more FPS, actually. And here I actually went back to TAA because I couldn't believe it. I thought that maybe it was a mistake. But yeah, going back to TAA does introduce very noticeable ghosting, unfortunately. But let's try FSR now. We'll try FSR Quality at 4K. And yeah, FSR has ghosting as well, actually. I mean, it's almost like FSR is upscaling the TAA that's in the game or something. I don't know. Whereas DLSS, maybe it's like replacing it. I think that's how that works. Don't quote me on that. I think that's what I've heard. But it's quite interesting, actually. How good of a job DLSS does. I mean, this applies here where DLSS does look better than native, in my opinion. It just does. It looks very nice. Lastly, I wanted to touch on frame generation briefly. Well, I was actually having trouble turning it on. It was grayed out for me. And that's because I had played in HDR previously and it was left checked off. And if that's enabled somehow or even checked off, DLSS frame generation remains grayed out. The other caveat is that you can't turn it on unless you enable DLSS super resolution, which I'm not the biggest fan of, right? Because I would like to be able to turn frame generation on without any upscaling. In this particular case, DLSS looks better than native, so it makes sense. But yeah, if we throw DLSS, we get 90 FPS, and if we throw DLSS frame generation, we seem to hit around 120 FPS. And it looks, for the most part, it looks pretty good. But there are a few issues I'll point out that are mostly UI related, but I recorded some 120 FPS footage that I wanted to share with you guys, and then we'll wrap up the video. Alright guys, so here we go. I've captured this at 120 FPS and slowed it down to 50%, and look at the names of these, like the dock worker. See how there's a little bit of jitter and garbling of the UI element on top of his head? It's stuff like that. It does stand out a bit when you pan the camera around, but I mean, other than that, it's actually pretty decent. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that, because I've got comments about this before when I make this type of an examination, that the camera sometimes feels almost like it jitters a bit. Well, that's because we are capturing this, recording it at 120 FPS. So if the FPS drops below that, it's going to record duplicate frames to make up for that 120, if that makes sense. And it's also variable. So, and then also, like, the tiniest of stutter will cause that camera effect to happen like that. But while you're playing, it actually feels pretty smooth. Unless it's an actual game stutter, which would also affect the generated frames. But my biggest thing that stands out the most, like I said, is the UI elements on top of NPC's head, like their names or the outline that can jitter and garble. But if you look at the characters, our characters' feet running, that's usually where it tends to break up the most, or it's at the most noticeable. It's very fast moving object. And here it actually looks pretty good. Even though we've slowed it down, I'd say it looks pretty good. It doesn't look that bad. Now for me, would I use frame generation? No, I rarely use it. I think with DLSS quality here, it would be more than plenty for me. But I decided to check it out anyway, just because it is a feature and people do like to use it. But anyway, I do like the game. I'm looking forward to playing it when it releases finally. And yeah, let me know what you guys think down below. Leave a comment, like the video if you liked it, and consider subscribing if you want to see more content like this. And I appreciate you watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.